Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG Jung-helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
All right. Good evening to you, everyone. And I want to talk today about a special topic because when Jung is mentioned, very often Freud is also mentioned, not only because they lived at the same time, but because they also worked together. And just to put a little bit into a reference frame, there's a way to structure Jung's life into certain blocks. And his life's work pretty much follows his own life. And there can be these blocks very neatly distinguished. And the first block in his life is a psychoanalytic block, where Jung was a professor and also taught about psychoanalysis. He practiced. He worked with Freud very closely together. And this is in the first part till age 39. With the other part, the next one following, which is the part that most people know, with the archetypes, the collective unconscious, anima, animus, where he explores and develops his ideas there. And the last part is the alchemical part where many people don't go, but where he also talks about ions and synchronicity. So his ideas become more and more all-compassing and complex to get into. And the very beginning is the psychoanalysis part, which is personal because it's around patients. So what I will talk about will be very much colored by Jung's view on Freud. There's the collective works, for those who have it or want to have it. There's the fourth book. I have it here in German. It's called Freud and Psychoanalysis. It's a neat little book because it really focuses on this topic of Freud and psychoanalysis. When Jung was thinking about how to structure his collected works and his life's work, his first impulse was to say, okay, when people should read me, they should read me in chronological sequence, because then people can see, okay, what developed after what. And on a certain point of view, it makes sense. On the other, Jung talks about so many different things, his whole life, that it's better to bundle these things. And this book is also a bundling. So here you have, within one volume, his very beginning views on psychoanalysis, where he is basically sending fan letters to Freud, and he's helping him fight against critics, then coming good friend of him, and then later changing his views. So it's a book that's spanning decades of Jung's personal development and his life and his views on psychoanalysis. But it's not only that which I read. I also read The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud. And I read an introduction into psychoanalysis also by Freud. Freud is a little bit easier to read because that's not so much. Freud did not write so many things, and he was more of a guy who would rewrite things, not for their topics, but rather he would expand and refine it a little bit. And you really notice it when you read The Interpretation of Dreams, which came out in 1899. And he would publish revisions of that the next 10, 20 years. And it's a very well structured book. So you really get the feeling that somebody invested a lot of time in there. But because Jung was such a close friend of Freud, I guess he also has a lot of unique insights on Freud's, not only Freud's theories, but also his personality, how he was privately. I will just talk a little bit about Jung's life and how he came into contact with Freud and how their friendship started. So when Jung had to decide what to study, he was unsure what to do, and he was thinking about doing archaeology because he was very interested in the past, passion that stuck with him his whole life, or whether he should go into medicine. And this was something that troubled him a lot because he knew he wanted to study, and he wanted to study in Basel. But it was a dream that finally convinced him what to do, that he should pursue the path of medicine. And there he got into contact with psychology as a field. And back then, this is around 1900, psychology was a completely new field. It was the newest science. It was the bleeding edge, like the Silicon Valley IT startup crypto space of, okay, we are now exploring a new realm of the world and nothing is really clear. It's really like discovering a new continent. And he uses that metaphor very often. So there's a clear distinction between the world before psychology and after psychology, the discovery of the psyche. And one very clear distinction is that how patients were treated. So when somebody would have psychological problems, the going theory was that they had brain damage. When somebody has brain damage, there's basically nothing you can do. And so they would just put the people somewhere just to store them like furniture, wait till they would die someday. But there was not really an attempt to treat them or really a successful way to treat them. Jung grew up in that atmosphere where this was a change of, okay, there might be something more to the patients than just the problems and the symptoms that they have. And he would be very involved also in analyzing the brains of people who had died that had psychological problems. And he could not find any statistical relevant damage of the brains that you could say, okay, this part is rotten. This is why the person cannot live normally. So he got very suspicious about the orthodoxy back then. He would start doing his own experiments. So he would study medicine, he would study psychology, he would start working in Burgholzli, which was a psychiatric institution in Switzerland. And he would start to design his own experiments to get his own data about delving into the psyche of people. And the method that he's invented is called the association test. And the association test works in the way that you give people a word, for example, family, a house, child, money, and you would try to get their reaction. So the idea is the patient is just giving word as a stimulus, and they would give back the reaction. And of course, the word would be noted that the patient said, but also the time that it took the patient to say the word. And he worked on that for a very long time and got some really interesting results. This was this investigation into the psyche, because there was a certain phenomena that people normally, they would get into a kind of groove and they would say a reaction within a certain time frame, very short seconds. But sometimes when he would say a word, there would be a long pause, and sometimes the patients would even forget the word, and they would give some reaction, but very often delayed. And the smart thing that Jung did was to make the same test again, same words, same order, but very often the patients, the word that they said that was so delayed, that came where the answer came very late, they used a different word. So everything was the same, but then they used something else. Or he would point out, oh, you said that word, and they could not remember. And this made him suspicious that there would be something in the psyche acting outside of the willful control of the person, that the person was not aware what the person would say, that there would trigger something happening in the background that would be distracting and autonomous. And back then, there was not really a word for that. And the word came through Freud. And this was the unconscious, that there's background processes happening that we are not aware of, but they are influencing our life. Jung was doing these experiments already for a pretty long time and was following the literature of all the people who would publish about the topics. And he said Freud was the first person who could come up with something as a concept of the mind that would explain the empirical findings of Jung. And of course, Jung was immediately a huge fan of Freud. And he would write all these letters to him, and he would argue with people about psychoanalysis, and he would become very well versed in psychoanalysis. And finally, he had the chance to meet Freud. For the first time that they met, they spoke for 13 hours straight. They just talked for 13 hours. And this was the beginning of the friendship. Jung back then was in his mid-30s, early 30s, rather, and Freud was 20 years older. He was in his 50s. So there was this age difference, And also this difference a little bit of who is, let's say, well known or who is hyped right now. And Freud was very popular back then because of his book of the interpretation of dreams and his ideas of psychoanalysis and the unconscious, especially in Europe. Interestingly, the ideas and methods of Jung became very popular in the US. So they traveled also around, also to the US. And there, Jung was more well known and popular than Freud back then. But this would shift over time. So they became incredibly close. They wrote a lot in regards to letters to each other. They would analyze each other's dreams. So it was really Freud's hope and idea that Jung, because he was 20 years younger, could take over the scepter and bring psychoanalysis into the world. Because Freud had a little bit of chip on his shoulder. He had to convince the world of something which is very hard to understand and to believe, to say, okay, you're not the Lord in your own house. And to say, okay, there is all these forces inside you and you need to deal with them. And there's also outside help necessary to do this. As they worked together, Jung himself said he followed Freud, also like a father figure, not only because of the age, but also Jung was a little bit disillusioned with his own father, who died pretty young in Jung's life. And there was this teacher-student dynamic happening there, even though that Jung, as I said, he was established. He published his own papers, did his own research. He was already a doctor or professor teaching. But this is the part that many people know when you talk about Jung and Freud, when they say, oh yeah, it's a pupil of Freud. But that's not completely correct. This is how they showed up. But Jung was established as a psychologist and as a therapist all on his own. But over the years, Jung realized that there are some differences in worldview and understanding, that he thought of Freud's idea as a little bit restricting and simple in certain regards. Jung was always very interested in the occult, the spiritual and religious, and Freud would have nothing of that. He would be not interested in that at all because he saw himself really as a fighter who could not deviate from his idea about psychoanalysis and libido as source of psychic functioning. He did not want to have any strange ideas in there that could distract from the ideas of psychoanalysis. But this was something that was gnawing on Jung, and it got only worse with time. As I said before, they were analyzing each other's dreams, but with time they would start hiding their dreams from each other. One started with Freud, who said, okay, I had a dream, but I did not want to talk with you about it because I felt it would undermine my authority. And this is when Jung got suspicious. And Jung also had a specific dream about a house which not only had a cellar, but multiple cellars where you could travel back in time, where it was the 1800s, then the 1000s, then ancient Rome, and in final, like a Neanderthal cave. And there he already had the feeling, I cannot tell this dream to Freud because he would interpret these things into there. So they were already living apart a bit. The relationship ended after roughly 6 and 7 years in a very dramatic way, how doctors and professors end friendships by writing a book. And Jung wrote a book called Symbols of Transformation. It's the 5th book of the collective works. The original title was a little bit different, but the modern name is Symbols of Transformation. And it had all the stuff in it that Freud did not want to talk about. It was about religion, mythology, spirituality, and all those things. And he sent it to Freud, and he only got a letter back that said something like, okay, seems like you want to do your own thing now. It's a code for me. But what it meant was the end of their friendship, but also of Jung's career, and he knew this. So his academic career was done. He was tightly associated with Freud. Freud was at that time very powerful, and he cut Jung just completely off. So Jung could not teach anymore, and he withdrew. He still had his private practice, but he knew that his career that he worked for, basically his whole life, was with that over. But he had the feeling that there was the right thing to do. And if you think about it, the things that everybody knows about Jung, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, but also ions or the views on alchemy, all this came afterwards. Before it was Jung, the psychoanalyst, but afterwards it became Jung, the phenomenon. That is the reason why we still talk about him now. And interestingly, in the collective works, the first 4 books are about this block in Jung's life, about his work in psychoanalysis. And this is a block where I think it's the least read part, but it is highly, highly interesting to understand Jung and where he's coming from. And this is also why I wanted to talk about this, to have the background to understand that. So, to give an introduction into Freudian psychoanalysis, as I said, it's an easier way to do it. You have to think of yourself as the ego, the person which is experiencing things, with the it under it, where you have all the primal forces and instincts that are trying to act on the ego. And you have the super ego, which is the rules of society and the laws, how you were educated as a child. And they act like a selector. And they say, oh, this is a good instinct to have. This is not a good instinct to have. Oh, this is not appropriate now. And everything that gets discarded into the unconscious. So the Freudian idea is that the unconscious is like a waste basket where you have a lot of things that can accumulate there. And if you discard the wrong things or discard the right things, this can create trouble in the psyche of the person and prevent the ego from working normally. These things in the unconscious are complexes that can cause neurosis or hysteria, which brings the person to act in strange ways. But through talking with the patient through these problems, to take the things from the wastebasket and bring them to light, there's a way to heal the person of the complexes, of the hysteria, and make them functioning normally again, that they're part of society, part of life. And this was a revolutionary thing. As I mentioned before, the idea was, oh, you're damaged goods, there's nothing you can do. And the idea from Freud is, and this is why it's called the talking cure, you can talk with people through their problems and you can heal them. And not only in their psyche, but also bodily, that there are certain symptoms that disappear when you help people working through their problems. And talking about the things that are in the unconscious, he would often use hypnosis. So this was a tool which was not really used back then before, but he would hypnotize the patients or try to hypnotize them to open up the unconscious and to bring out these very dark contents, because these are contents that were not approved of from the parents of the patient, of society. And the complexes that Freud saw in this wastebasket, they were very often associated with the parents, with the mother, with the father. And he said the main drive of the it is libido, is sexuality, the sexual drive. And this sexual drive needs to be steered in the correct direction. And he said the natural way how this libido normally flows is towards the mother, sexuality towards the mother or towards the father. But this is frowned upon by society, so it goes into the wastebasket. But it should not be in the wastebasket, it should be used differently. So the idea of Freudian psychology is to say, okay, you have to find your mother in a partner, or you have to find your father in a job, to steer this energy in a productive outward direction, not inward towards the family, but outward to the world. So this is called the incest complex that is blocking the patient in living their own life. And he compares this to an infantilization, that people are still like a child. So even though they should grow up. For this, he also used dream interpretation. And this is one of the other things that Freud brought back into the modern world, to use dreams as a diagnostic tool. So this was lost for hundreds, thousands of years, because dreams are a little bit of individual revelation, which is a big no-no in Christianity, but had a higher value in ancient societies, like Roman societies, Greek societies, and earlier Egyptian societies. So he rediscovered that, and he established that as a valid diagnostic tool. And this is, should you read the interpretation of dreams, you would find it there, that he's very meticulous and takes it incredibly serious, and has a lot of concepts there that you can even try yourself, and you can find out, oh, okay, yeah, what Mr. Freud wrote over 100 years ago, you can find in your own dreams. So this is interesting, really interesting. This is just to give you a rough overview about psychoanalysis. And about all these points that I just mentioned, Jung started to develop different ideas. This had to start with the idea of sexuality, because Freud talked about sexuality in a way broader sense than the word would suggest. So we have a pretty clear idea what sexuality means. But for Freud, he used it so broadly that Jung even doubted whether it would be still the correct word, or rather that it would be the survival instinct or the instinct to continue living. Because in Freudian psychology, the idea is that the first burst of sexuality is when you are a small child and you, for example, you will want to eat the whole time. And then you kind of forget your sexuality until you hit puberty, where it's the second surge of sexuality. Jung said, okay, this is maybe a little bit too restrictive to call that sexuality. So Jung took the libido term and used it rather as a psychic energy to have, okay, it's neutral in that regard. I can use it in any way. It can manifest in any way. But he did not want to talk about hunger only in a sexual context. Also, this is a little bit confusing because everybody already has a pretty clear idea what sexuality means. What Freud would also do, he would try to reduce ideas a lot. So the reason why he would not like to talk about religion, for example, was because he said, yeah, well, in its basis, it's just a father complex. You want to be liked by your father, and you're in awe with your father. And this is why you like religion, because religion, it has rules, and we need rules because the rules is the reasons why we don't sleep with our parents. For Freud, it's really this more and more simplification of the world, where he said, oh yeah, Hadrian built the wall in Great Britain because he wanted to impress his wife to have sex. Yeah, people started religion because they were in awe with their father. Of course, you can try to reduce it like that. But Jung said, it's not the right approach to take the complexity of the world and just bring it down to singular factor. And Freud said, okay, all the problems stem from the incest complex. And said, yeah, okay, possibly, but does it really account for the whole experience of human beings? And does it really explain anything? Because it's very easy to reduce something, but you cannot say, okay, there exists something like sexuality, and this is why Hadrian built the wall. There has to be steps in between, and these were missing for Jung. Another fault that Freud had, just as his way of working, was that Freud would never revise or correct. This goes back to this idea of establishing himself as a new force that cannot be distracted by something else, or that cannot be come up in a confused manner. It has to be always to be on point. It can only be this one thing. It has to be psychoanalysis. It has to be sexuality. What many people know about psychoanalysis is oh, there was a trauma in childhood, and this is why the grown-up person now has a problem. And this was an early idea of psychoanalysis. And Freud wrote about this as a source of hysteria, because when he talked to the patients, then the patients would start talking about childhood experiences that would come up through psychoanalysis. He said, oh, okay, this explains why this grown person now has a problem. But as Freud would reveal over time in letters to Jung, these cases that he used as a basis for that later turned out never actually happened. There's a phenomena that the patients immediately wanted to go to childhood themselves and revealed this information, revealed fantasies that did not actually happen, which were the ground why Freud started with his ideas. But at the same time, Freud did not want to revise himself in that regard, that he would fundamentally change concepts. So he would still write that and publish that, or let's say the original works, keep them unchanged, which caused, of course, a little bit of confusion. And Jung had to correct a lot of critics of psychoanalysis that he said, okay, this is not valid anymore. This is not even how Freud thinks anymore. And the logic that Jung built on that to say, okay, why do patients have the need to talk about their childhood? Why suddenly these fantasies in the past come up? For him was rather the idea that the patient is failing at a task that is existing right now. And his metaphor was when somebody gets tuberculosis, it's not because they had contact with the tuberculosis bacteria in their childhood, they had it just now. So his idea was that there was a task that the person needed to do, but could not do for whatever reason. So the libido, the neutral, in the Jungian sense, force, psychic force, instead of pushing forward, would hit a barrier and flow backward. So it would start activating all these old contents of the past, which would kind of distract the person from the actual problem that is lying right before them. So it's like a distraction mechanism. For example, that people were upset that they did not marry the right person, right? Or they were not even married. They could not find a partner. They could not find a job. The important people around them died. And that this was the task at hand that need to be solved and not to be distracted by the past. You needed to talk about that and talk through it, but there needs to be something differently done to change it now. What Jung did not like about the Freudian psychoanalysis had to do with unearthing these things. So the Freudians that later worked were in their mind very more strict than Freud himself, because they oriented more on the books, it seems like. So a lot of things in psychoanalysis is about resistance from the patient, that the patient does not want to talk about the thing because it's the mother complex or the incest complex or the father complex. And Jung said, okay, this is not the right approach, because he saw it more that the therapists would try to dig for complexes, because he was certain there had to be the incest complex because it's the center of the psyche, the reason why people do things. So it would rather be pushing and steering and directing the patient in a certain direction to hit something, to find the complex. Because for Freud was really, okay, if I take the complex out of the wastebasket and bring it to light and give it a name, very important thing, it will lose its power. Freud even went so far that he said, one day there will be no more neurotics because we found all the names of the complexes that are in the psyche, which is a kind of romantic idea to say, okay, there's an end because we just named everything. But this was how Freud operated, according to Jung. How the therapist would work with a patient, this is also something that Jung did not like. As in a Freudian sense, the therapist is in the background, not even seen. He's behind the patient, just asking questions. And the patient would just say what they think, the associations, and follow those associations. So the idea was, okay, at a certain point we will hit a complex, then we will be in the unconscious, and then we can bring it to light. But what Jung did not like about it was the complete removal of the therapist as a person. The Jungian way of doing therapy would be a rather more personal way. Also not to give the patient a free flow of associations that just build on top of each other, but rather to find association about a specific topic and build on those to explore a specific topic more, and not from piece to piece to piece to piece to piece. And the absolute biggest problem that Jung had with Freud, and which was likely one of the main reasons why they separated ways, was Freud's ideas about dreams. Jung took dreams incredibly seriously. Freud also did. But the theories of Freud, they're a little bit hard to get. So I read the interpretation of dreams. I'm still not completely sure that I understood it correctly. The idea is that there's something in the back of the mind of every person, and that's called the sensor. So when people dream, the goal is that the person does not wake up. It's like a fulfillment of a wish. So what the sensor will do, it will try to hide the contents of the dream behind a facade to not upset the dreamer, to keep it dreaming. So it will tell the dreamer a lie so that the dreamer will keep on dreaming. And the idea is interesting in that sense that psychoanalysis has this as a staple, as a basic premise, that the first thing you encounter does not have to be the real thing in the background. As I said before, people that had psychological problems, symptoms, even bodily, it was never about those symptoms, but rather, okay, there has to be some reason behind it that is causing this. Freud also applied this to the dreams to say, okay, you dream of a grown man in an overcoat, and this is something sexual because the overcoat could be interpreted as a penis. This, of course, then would go back to the incest complex and so on. This would be the Freudian way how to get to there. And Jung said, okay, this can't be completely correct because what Freud is doing again, he reduces to say, okay, you have an overcoat versus a penis versus incest complex. But Jung said, okay, why? When you have all these possibilities in the world, what it could be, why is this person dreaming of this? When somebody is dreaming of a fairy, we don't have to say, okay, this is representing your mother. We have to ask the question, why is it a fairy? It could be anything in the world. Because when you can reduce anything to a mother complex, there are 10,000 ways to do it. But why does the mind come up with a fairy? And he said, it's very dishonest to say, okay, everything is a facade, because then you cannot really be sure what you're actually treating. In the end, it becomes a little bit vague what the therapist then actually does, because he has all this evidence, but he ignores the evidence and say, oh, well, actually, there's something behind it, but we cannot see it. So it's like treating a disease that you can't really measure or find directly. I made a whole episode about the complexities of Jungian dream interpretation as a diagnostic tool, which is very interesting, very hard to get into because Jung tries to combine all this complexity into it. But Freud is, okay, reduce it down, find the complex, name the complex, bring it to light, and then it's done. When I talked before about the concept that things come from the it to the ego, and then they get discarded into the unconscious. This means that everything that's in the unconscious first had to be conscious because it has to be repressed to be in the unconscious. So it has to be filtered out by the rules, norms of society, how the person grew up. And Jung said that's not true. People can have things in their unconscious that they're not even aware of. So his idea is not that the unconscious comes from consciousness, but rather the other way around, that consciousness is a product of the unconscious. His overall view was that Freud was more like a destructor. And this was important in the world back then. You have to see when psychology was new. Before the worldview was the Victorian age, it was very materialistic. That's why people thought, okay, the brain is damaged because it was more of a way of the world through a materialistic lens. And also very repressed sense, the Victorian age, where people would not even talk about sex with their own partners. So the value of Freud, Jung saw as a great liberator, as a historic necessity to give people suddenly the room to talk about sexuality, to create a space where this is okay, the things that have been actually be ignored or repressed before, to give them a stage. And he also said the value of hypnosis was that, to give people a stage to talk about it. It was not so important whether hypnosis works or not. The idea, the premise to say, okay, yeah, when you say something in hypnosis, that's not really you, it's your unconscious, already gave people a way to get away from this repression. So even when it sounded, what I talked about, the ideas of Freud, that it's very negative in the Jung's view, this is just arguing about some facets and some single ideas and viewpoints. The basic basis of Jungian psychoanalysis or analytical psychology, how Jung called it, is deeply, deeply rooted in psychoanalysis. So there are many things they agree on. There's a lot of common ground. There are some things that Jung does not criticize or ignore. He never talks about there is not something like the unconscious. And he doesn't say there is not something like the ego. He says that dreams are a valid tool of interpretation, and there are psychic forces that act on us, and that sexuality, of course, is a part of the psyche, but there are more forces working on that. He even credits Freud by discovering the very first archetype, the Oedipal complex, the boy who wants to sleep with his mother, the incest complex. He says this is something that's not even personal. It's even lower than that. It's in the collective unconscious. It's an archetype. It's something that people live through actually, but it's not that it's born on the individual experience of the person, but rather it's the collective part under that. The metaphor would be, we think we live in a house, and Freud discovered there's a cellar under it that we're not aware of, and where things happen, strange things. And Jung found out, okay, under there are tunnels that connect all the cellars to each other, that there's a collective part. So Freud very much stays with the personal. He says, oh, the rules that you get, the superego, this is your personal experience you got from your parents and the country you live in, the government. And yeah, you have these forces, but they're very simple, be it. And when you have something in your unconscious, it's only personal stuff. And Jung says, oh, no, this is way more complex. You have to think about primal things that move centuries and millennia and cultures and countries and events all around the world, artwork, and so on. You can find this in the naming of Jung's brand of psychoanalysis. It's analytical psychology. It's not a completely different thing, but rather it's a switching on the terms. It's a variation about the basic structures. This is why I think it's also very important to read the first 4 books of the collected works to see, okay, where is Jung coming from? And this is why I insisted on, okay, if you want to understand me, it's the best idea to see how everything grew. Because even when he talks about archetypes, when he talks about ions or alchemy, it's all rooted on a psychoanalytic basis. I was similar in that regard. When I read the collective works, I started with the fun stuff. I started with symbol of transformation and the religion and psychology and collective unconscious and all those things. And then I said, okay, I want to read everything. So I read the first 4 books, and it blew my mind, because to see these ideas always stick with Jung, and they were always around. The idea that there are complexes that work within us. So the idea of analytical psychology was first to call it complex psychology, and that a neurosis has to be lived out, that it has to be brought to life, this complex. Jung also fully agreed. He practiced his whole life like that. He also felt that psychoanalysis was very misunderstood by the critics and everyone else, even though that they were separated as persons. They afterwards they had close to no contact. They did some referrals for patients, but otherwise they really had no contact anymore for the rest of their life. He still stayed with psychoanalysis and bring this forward, but to build on it continuously. So this is something that has to be kept in mind. To talk a little bit about Freud as a person, how Jung saw him. He saw Freud as a neurotic person, interestingly, that was struggling internally a lot. And he saw Freud also as a very introverted person, but an introverted feeling person. So those who are familiar with Jung's typology, the feeling function is about valuing things, to give a value judgment. Okay, do I like it? Don't I like it? And he said there, Freud was very proficient and very differentiated, sophisticated. But where he saw Freud inferior was the thinking. Interesting enough, where he would say that Freud would not have necessarily the right word or the right thinking to express actually what he feels, but he focused on that because he was neurotic, scrambling his psyche a little bit. But he credits Freud with the achievements that he's done, and he really disliked the people who followed Freud, because those people were systematic and incredibly strict, and they argued not so much how Freud would do. So, as I mentioned before, in private, Freud was more open to other things and also to alternative variations of his own ideas. But in public, he was incredibly strict about what he would think and how his knowledge should be transported. And Jung goes on and on and on. I read his letters about the Freudians who make a little bit of a caricature of themselves, especially as he knew Freud best, but they started trying to tell him what Freud actually meant. So this relationship that they had was an unusual relationship because they were very different people, very different people. For one thing, Freud was Jewish and Jung was Protestant, not really a believer, but he grew up like that. Jung was younger, Freud was older. This worldview of theirs was too different to bring it together. So it's amazing that they worked together like this for a very long time. But as I said, it was because Jung really took himself back up to the point where he could not stand it anymore and he had to break free and find his own way. And if you're interested in finding more about their dynamic, there's a movie about it called The Dangerous Method with Viggo Mortensen, Michael Fassbender, and Keira Knightley, which is really interesting movie to see because it's really about this time and it really ends with the end of their friendship. But it is about Jung trying to establish himself. Jung was also very rich because he married the second richest woman in Switzerland back then. Freud was always very poor. And to have those work together must have been really interesting to see. Why I wanted to do this event was not really to make like a competition and say, okay, you have Jung, you have Freud, who's correct, who's right? Jung himself gave the answer on that. And he said, it's just a different way how the psyche works. Not every person is the same, and there are different ways how the psyche operates for personality-wise. And he said, there are people, their psyche works in a Freudian sense. They're completely Freudian. It works actually for them like that. But then there are also other people who work like Adler, who was also very famous back then, how his psychology focused on power instead of sexuality. And he said there's a subset of people whose minds seem to work like Jung's mind. And it is the question how you approach those persons, especially in regard to the therapy. Because where Jung agreed upon was the first part of life, the first half, Freudian analysis would work. And it would work really well to get people out of the basement of the parents, to establish them in the world, to redirect the libido outwards, to take them out of the family unit, to not have them be children anymore, but rather establish their own life and establish themselves in the world. And there he said the success rate was very, very high and it would really help people. But it's just a specific area where this works. The second part of life does not work in a Freudian sense anymore because people very often are already established. They have a partner, they have a career, a house, whatever. They are established. So trying to get them out of the basement of their parents does not work because they are already out for a very long time. So the methods that are needed are then different. This is where Jung worked with letting people getting into contact with their creative side, to let them draw, for example, to see that it's more than the outside world inside of them. But yeah, Freud was so right about so many things that it got absorbed into our cultural understanding. So we still do the same thing. We do the talking cure. The whole industry of coaching is built on that. You can talk with people through problems to bring them into a better state. And we are completely convinced now that there's something like the unconscious. There is something like psychology. All these ideas, premises of Freud, we have adapted now, and they're even in our language to blow off steam. It's already there to release the libido in that sense. And this has the effect, because we absorbed everything of Freud already, all the weird stuff is left. So when people think about Freud, it's only these very weird ideas like, oh, okay, all the girls want to have penises and all the boys want to sleep with their mothers. And it's from the beginning of a time where these ideas and concepts came up. And very often they are also differently meant, how they are now remembered. But this is a little bit like the event or phenomenon of Nirvana, which was back then revolutionary, but spread so much into just the cultural zeitgeist and also into music and how especially rock music is made, that they don't seem special anymore. because everyone is like them. We are now all Freudians in a sense. So it makes it harder to absorb the very last rest because it's just the weird stuff left now. The other thing is already deep into our culture integrated. So this would be my introduction and elaboration into Freudian psychology, Jung's views on it, and also how Jung is compatible to that. And this is really the thing I want to drive home. Jung has many different facets where you want to look at. So people are interested in the personality aspect of MBTI, which came out of Jung, or they're interested in astrology or in ions, the collective unconscious, archetypes, anima, animus, all these things, shadow. It all rests very, very firmly on a psychoanalytic foundation that is kept constant through the whole life of Jung. So this block is really the building block of everything that came on later. So this is why I wanted to do the event, to give you a view that you cannot get anywhere so often, because many people did not actually read the books, the first four of the collective works. So I want to thank you, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you had also a little bit of fun.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG jung-helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.